The man smelled like old rain and worn leather. His coat was too big for his frame. The kind of coat that looked like it belonged to someone else, someone who had once been larger, fuller, more certain of their place in the world. The hem dragged slightly at the back. One button was missing. The collar was creased in a way that suggested it had been slept in more than once. His shoes were brown, cracked at the toe, and separated at the sole on the left side so that when he walked, there was a faint soft flap against the pavement, like a slow, tired applause that nobody had asked for. He walked into Grace Fellowship Church on a Tuesday morning in November, just as the frost was beginning to settle on the window ledges of downtown Millbrook, Ohio. He walked slowly. Not the slowness of age, though he looked somewhere past 60. It was the slowness of a man who has learned to conserve himself, who has learned that speed costs energy, and energy costs more than most people understand when they have never truly run out of it. The food pantry was held in the lower hall of Grace Fellowship every Tuesday and Thursday, from 9 in the morning until noon. A white banner above the entrance to the lower hall read, in big blue letters, "All are welcome." No one turned away. The man read the sign. He pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. What happened in the next 4 minutes would set something in motion that the people of that church, and one man in particular, would spend years trying to understand. Welcome. Stay right where you are. Because this story is going to take you somewhere real, somewhere uncomfortable, and somewhere ultimately powerful. Pour yourself something warm, find a comfortable seat, and do not go anywhere. Because by the time this story ends, you will understand something about judgment, grace, and consequence that no sermon ever quite manages to say out loud. This is the story of a man named Arthur, and a pastor named Gerald Cole, and the very different ways the same morning broke open inside each of them. Arthur James Whitfield was 63 years old, and he had once owned 4 companies. Not the small, local kind. Not the kind that operated out of a strip mall with 2 employees and a shared printer. The kind with flaws. The kind with board meetings and quarterly reports and a name that appeared on the side of buildings. Whitfield Development Group had, at its peak, employed over 800 people across 3 states and built or renovated more than 200 affordable housing units, commercial spaces, and community infrastructure projects in underserved communities across the Midwest. That was the life he had built. The life that was taken from him started with a phone call on a Thursday in March, 3 years ago. His business partner of 22 years, a man named Dennis Holt, a man who had been best man at Arthur's wedding, a man who had held Arthur's youngest daughter when she was 3 hours old and cried genuine tears, had spent the previous 18 months quietly and methodically routing funds from the company's operating accounts through a series of shell companies that Arthur had never been told existed. When the federal investigation opened, both names were on the letterhead. Dennis had a lawyer on retainer for 11 years. Arthur did not. Dennis had moved the evidence carefully. Arthur had trusted completely. By the time Arthur understood the full shape of what had happened to him, the assets were frozen, the company was in receivership, and his face, his tired, shocked, disbelieving face, was on the front page of the Millbrook Gazette below a headline that said, "Local developer charged in $4 million fraud scheme." His wife, Carol, lasted 4 months after the charges were filed. Not because she believed the charges. She told him she didn't. She held his hand in the kitchen and said, "I know you didn't do this." But the weight of it, the stares at the grocery store, the friends who stopped returning calls, the daughter who cried on the phone from college because someone had sent her the article. The weight broke something in Carol that the love between them could not fully carry. She went to stay with her sister in Columbus. She said it was temporary. She never came back. Arthur did not hate her for it. He told himself, in the long quiet of the apartment he was renting by then, that everyone had a limit. That love was real and still had limits. That a person could love you and still not be able to survive the storm that surrounds you. He told himself this. Whether he believed it fully was something he kept in a room inside himself that he did not open often. The charges against Arthur were eventually dropped, all of them. A forensic accounting firm, hired by Arthur's legal team on a payment plan, traced the money cleanly to Dennis Holt's network of shell accounts. Dennis pleaded guilty 18 months later to wire fraud, tax evasion, and breach of fiduciary duty. He received a 7-year sentence. Arthur received an apology from the federal prosecutor's office in the form of a 2-paragraph letter. 2 paragraphs. For 3 years of his life. By the time the charges were dropped, Arthur had lost the company. Lost the house. Lost most of his savings to legal fees. Lost his marriage. Lost most of his friends, who had drifted away in that particular way people drift when someone's trouble has the possibility of becoming contagious. He was not broke in the way a man is broke when he has never had anything. He was broke in the way a man is broke when everything he built is gone and he is standing in the rubble of it at 63 years old wondering what exactly he is supposed to do next. He moved to Millbrook because the rent was low and he knew no one there. Knowing no one, it turned out, felt easier than being known. He found a room in a boarding house on Caldwell Street. He ate simply. He walked a great deal. He applied for jobs that his former employees would have found embarrassing, and was grateful when he got them. He bagged groceries at a food mart for 3 months. He did custodial work at a community center. He volunteered at a literacy program on Saturday mornings because it was the one thing that still made him feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with money. He had not walked into Grace Fellowship because he was hungry. He had walked in because of the sign. All are welcome. No one turned away. He had seen it twice before, passing the church on his morning walks, and something about those words had pulled at him in a way he hadn't fully examined. He had heard versions of that phrase his entire life, in churches his mother had taken him to as a boy, in the mission statements of the non-profits his company had partnered with over the years. He had even used versions of it himself, in speeches he gave at ribbon cuttings for affordable housing projects, when he talked about what a community owed its most vulnerable members. He had believed it then. He wanted to know if someone else believed it now. So he put on the old coat. The one that told a story that wasn't quite his, but wasn't quite a lie either. He had worn coats like this. He had been in circumstances that called for coats like this. The coat was not theater. It was just the version of himself that he had not yet fully moved past. He pushed open the door of Grace Fellowship's lower hall and stepped inside. Gerald Cole had been senior pastor of Grace Fellowship for 11 years. He was a trim man, 51 years old, with a clean dark haircut going silver at the sides in a way that his wife, Diane, said made him look distinguished and that Gerald privately agreed with. He wore good suits. Not showy, he was careful about that. He knew how the optics worked in a community like Millbrook, where half the congregation was working class and the other half was upper middle, and the wrong kind of suit sent the wrong kind of message. But good. Well pressed. A man who respected the pulpit enough to dress for it. Grace Fellowship had, under Gerald's leadership, grown from a congregation of 112 to over 600 regular attendees. They had renovated the sanctuary, built out the lower hall, launched a youth program that had won a state award 2 years running, and established the food pantry, his signature community initiative, which now served approximately 240 households per month. Gerald was proud of the pantry. He talked about it often. He mentioned it in sermons when he spoke about the mission of the church extending beyond its walls. He posted about it on the church's social media with photos of volunteers in matching aprons, smiling, holding boxes of canned goods. He had, the previous spring, been invited to speak at a regional pastors' conference about community outreach, and he had used the pantry as his primary example. We don't just open our doors on Sunday, he had said, from the podium, to nods and applause. We open them Tuesday and Thursday too. Because the Lord's work is not a once-a-week assignment. He believed that. He also believed in order. In systems. In the way things were supposed to work. The pantry had a protocol. You signed in at the front table. You provided your name and a brief household description. You waited until your name was called. You received your box, and you left through the side door to make room for the next family. Clean. Efficient. Dignified, Gerald always said. He wanted people to feel dignified. He did not want it to feel like a soup kitchen from a movie. He wanted it to feel like a church serving its neighbors with excellence. He was in the lower hall that Tuesday morning because Diane was home with a cold and he had come to check on the operation himself. He stood near the back table where the volunteers were staging boxes, reviewing the sign-in sheet, when he heard the front door open. He looked up, and he saw Arthur. The coat, the shoes, the slow, deliberate walk. The grey stubble that hadn't been shaved in perhaps 3 days. The eyes that were calm and clear and looking at everything with a quiet intensity that Gerald could not immediately place. Gerald felt something move through him. He would, later, when he was forced to examine it honestly, describe it as discomfort. A social discomfort. The kind that arrives when something doesn't match the picture you have in your mind. The food pantry served people from the community. Gerald knew most of them by now, or at least recognized most of them. This man he had never seen. This man also looked different. Not different in a bad way, not exactly, but different in a way Gerald couldn't quite name. There was something about the posture, something about the way the eyes moved. Like a man who was observing a room rather than merely entering one. Gerald set down the clipboard. He walked toward Arthur. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was pleasant. Professionally pleasant. The voice he used when he was managing something. Arthur looked at him. "I was hoping to get a food box," he said. His voice was quiet, low, the kind of voice that had once given speeches in rooms but had grown smaller with time. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the door behind Arthur, at the sign-in table near the entrance, where one of the volunteers, a young woman named Keisha, 24 years old, studying social work at the community college, was already watching the exchange. "We do require sign-in," Gerald said. "Name, address, household size. Standard procedure." "Of course," Arthur said. "Happy to do that." He moved toward the table. Keisha smiled at him and reached for the clipboard. And then Gerald said the thing. Later, he would not be able to fully explain why he said it. He would try. He would try many times, in private, and once in public, and the explanations would all be partially true and none of them would be fully sufficient, which is usually the sign that the real reason lives somewhere a man is not yet ready to look. He said, "Actually, sir, I'm going to need to have a word with you first." Arthur stopped. Keisha looked up from the clipboard. "We've been having some issues," Gerald continued. He said the word carefully enough that it landed softly, but the shape of it was still clear to everyone in the room. "With people coming through the pantry who are not genuinely in need. People taking advantage of the generosity of this congregation." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said. "We do have to be good stewards," Gerald continued. He was warming to the language now, the kind of language that sounded like principle. "These boxes represent donations from families in this church who give sacrificially. We have a responsibility to make sure those resources go to the people they're intended for." "Of course," Arthur said again. "I'm going to need to ask, do you live in the area? Are you a resident of Millbrook?" "I live on Caldwell Street," Arthur said. "And your employment situation?" The room was quiet. 2 other volunteers, an older man named Walt and a woman in her 40s named Sandra, had stopped what they were doing. They were not looking at Arthur. They were looking at their boxes. But they had stopped moving. Keisha had set the clipboard down. "I'm between situations," Arthur said simply. Gerald nodded slowly. The nod of a man arriving at a decision he had already made before the conversation began. "Here's what I'd suggest," he said. His voice was still managed, still controlled. "There's a shelter on the east side of town, Millbrook Community Resource Center. They have an intake process. If you go through their intake, they can connect you with services that are designed for your specific situation. Food, housing assistance, job placement. It might be a better fit than what we're offering here." The lower hall was very still. Arthur looked at Gerald for a long, even moment. "The sign outside," he said, "says no one is turned away." Gerald's expression shifted, just slightly. "That's the spirit of our mission," he said. "In practice, we do need to ensure." "I appreciate your time," Arthur said quietly. He turned around. He walked back to the door. He pushed it open. And he left. Keisha Watkins had grown up 3 blocks from this church. Her grandmother had attended Grace Fellowship for 30 years before she passed. Keisha herself had stopped attending regularly in her early 20s, not because she had lost her faith, but because something about the Sunday morning version of religion had started to feel, in her own private language, like a performance she couldn't fully afford to participate in. She volunteered at the pantry because the pantry felt different. More real. Less staged. She had been volunteering for 8 months. She had never seen Gerald turn anyone away before. She had never seen him question anyone before. Not like that. Not with that particular layering of politeness and exclusion. Those words that sounded like policy but functioned like a door. She stood very still after Arthur left, the clipboard in her hands, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Walt was already moving boxes again. Sandra was making a note on the distribution log. Gerald had turned back toward the staging table, his shoulders slightly squared, the way a man squares his shoulders when he has just made a decision he intends to live with. "Pastor Cole," Keisha said. He turned. "That man," she said. "He left." "I know," Gerald said. "I think the resource center will serve him better." "You sent him away." "I redirected him." "You asked him to prove he was poor enough," Keisha said. Her voice was not loud. It was not emotional in a way that wobbled. It was steady and clear, the way water is clear when it runs over stone. "You asked him his address and his job status before you let him sign in. You don't do that with anyone else." Gerald looked at her. "We've had issues." "You said that," Keisha said. "What issues?" "I've been here 8 months." "What issues?" The room was very still again. Walt had stopped moving boxes. Sandra was looking at her distribution log with the expression of a woman who is paying close attention to something else entirely. Gerald's jaw tightened, very slightly. "Keisha, I appreciate your concern. The way we manage this pantry." "I know how we manage this pantry," she said. "I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday. I know that the sign outside says all are welcome. And I know what I just watched." She set the clipboard down on the table. She picked up her coat and her bag from the chair behind her. "I'm going to go check on him," she said. She walked out of the lower hall. Gerald watched her go. The silence she left behind was the kind that has weight to it. He picked up his clipboard. He turned back to the boxes. His hands were not quite steady. Keisha found Arthur standing in the church parking lot. He wasn't upset. Exactly. Or rather, he was, but it had the quality of an old feeling in him. Something he had carried long enough that he knew how to hold it without it pulling him apart. He was looking at the sky. November sky. Gray and textured like the underside of something heavy. "Sir," Keisha said. He turned. "I'm sorry about what happened in there," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "That wasn't yours to give." "No," she said, "but someone should say it." He was quiet. Then, "It's all right." "It's not," she said simply. She held out a small paper bag. He looked at it. "I grabbed what I could carry," she said. "It's not a full box. But it's something." He looked at the bag. Then at her. Then he said, "I don't actually need the food." Keisha blinked. He said it without drama, without announcement. Just the plain fact of it, set down gently between them. "I came in," he said, "because I wanted to see whether the sign was true." She stood very still. "I've been a lot of things," he said. "And some of them I've been recently. And I know what it feels like to walk through a door that says everyone is welcome and find out at the other side that everyone has exceptions." He looked back at the church. "I wanted to see." Keisha stood in the cold parking lot with the small paper bag in her hands, looking at this man in the oversized coat with the separated sole flapping softly against the asphalt, and felt something very specific happen inside her, the feeling of a puzzle revealing its own shape. "Who are you?" she asked. He smiled. It was a tired smile and a real one. "Arthur Whitfield," he said. She didn't know the name. But she would. 3 days after Arthur walked out of Grace Fellowship's parking lot, Keisha's phone rang. It was her professor, Dr. Raymond Singh, who taught community development and non-profit management at the college. She had mentioned the pantry incident to him, not named anyone, not made it a formal complaint, just mentioned it in the way students mention things they are processing, and he had listened carefully and asked a few questions that she thought were just curiosity. They were not curiosity. "Keisha," he said. The man you described, Arthur Whitfield. Did he say where he lives? He mentioned Caldwell Street, she said. Why? A pause. Because I think I know who Arthur Whitfield is, Dr. Singh said. And I think the pastor of Grace Fellowship is going to want to know too. What Dr. Singh knew, and what a few minutes of research confirmed for Keisha as she sat on her dorm room bed with her laptop open and her coffee going cold, was this. Arthur James Whitfield had not always been a man in a worn coat walking slowly down Caldwell Street. He had been the founder and CEO of Whitfield Development Group, which had, among its many projects, built the Caldwell Street Community Center, the same building where Millbrook's youth programs operated, where the literacy volunteers met on Saturday mornings, where the after-school program for 83 children in this zip code ran Monday through Friday. He had also, through his foundation, provided the seed funding for Grace Fellowship's food pantry. The check had been written 6 years ago. $40,000. No strings attached, his lawyer had written in the accompanying letter, except one. That no one who comes through the door in genuine need should ever be turned away. Keisha read that line 3 times. She sat in her dorm room with her cold coffee and the grey November sky outside her window and felt the shape of Tuesday morning rearrange itself into something that made her breath short. She called Dr. Singh back. Does Pastor Cole know? She asked. Not yet, Dr. Singh said. That depends on what you want to do with what you know. She thought about the man in the parking lot. The way he said, I wanted to see if the sign was true. The way he said, I don't actually need the food. The tiredness in him that was not defeat. It was something more complicated. The tiredness of a man who had once built something with his hands and his faith and his money and was standing in front of a door that bore his fingerprints, listening to the man inside explain why he wasn't welcome. I need to make a phone call, she said. The meeting of Grace Fellowship's elders and deacon board took place the following Wednesday evening. Gerald had called it to discuss the fourth quarter budget and the pantry's winter expansion plans. He sat at the head of the table in the conference room off the main sanctuary, his reading glasses on, his agenda printed and distributed. He was, in all visible ways, the composed and capable leader he had spent 11 years building himself into. He did not know why 3 people on the board were quieter than usual. He did not know that one of them, Elder Margaret Powell, had received a phone call from Keisha Watkins 2 days earlier. He did not know that another, Deacon Frank Ellis, had spent an hour on Tuesday reading a legal document that Keisha had forwarded. The original donation agreement between Arthur Whitfield's Foundation and Grace Fellowship, signed 6 years ago, notarized, filed, and kept in the church's records in a folder that had not been opened since the development office turned over twice. He did not know that Arthur Whitfield himself was sitting in the parking lot, waiting, because Keisha had called him too. The meeting began normally. Gerald moved through the agenda. Budget updates. Volunteer numbers. A proposal for extended Thursday hours through December. Then Elder Margaret Powell said, Gerald, before we move on, there's something I'd like to raise. He looked at her over his reading glasses. It concerns the pantry, she said. Of course, he said. She slid a folder across the table. This is the original donation agreement for the food pantry, she said. From 6 years ago. I'd like us to review the language on page 2. Gerald opened the folder. He read the page. He read it twice. His face did not change dramatically. He was a controlled man. But something happened behind his eyes. A sequence of small, internal adjustments, like a building settling in a storm. I'm aware of this donation, he said carefully. Then you're aware of the condition, Margaret said. In principle. The condition is specific, Gerald, Frank Ellis said. His voice was level, not aggressive. Frank had been a deacon for 16 years. He was not a man who raised his voice. He had never needed to. No one who comes through the door in genuine need shall be turned away. Those are the exact words. Gerald set the folder down. Last Tuesday, Margaret said, a man came to the pantry and was turned away. I have a statement from one of our volunteers. She slid another paper across the table. Gerald looked at it. He recognized the description of the exchange he had with Arthur. Every word of it was accurate. Reading his own words back to himself in a clinical, documented format produced a sensation he did not have immediate language for. He was redirected, Gerald said. He was questioned, Margaret said. He was asked to prove his need in a way we do not ask of anyone else. And then he was turned away. The room was quiet. Who was he? Gerald said. Margaret looked at Frank. Frank looked at the table. Gerald, Margaret said quietly. The man you turned away from the food pantry last Tuesday is Arthur Whitfield. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Gerald looked up. The Arthur Whitfield who funded this pantry, Frank said. The man whose $40,000 built this program. Who wrote the condition into the agreement himself. Gerald sat very still. The reading glasses were still on his face. The agenda was still open in front of him. The conference room was warm and well-lit, as conference rooms in well-run churches tend to be. Everything was in its place. Everything except the pastor, who was discovering, in real time, what he had done. He walked in dressed, Gerald started. Yes, Margaret said. He did. I didn't know. No, she said. You didn't know. And that's exactly the point, Gerald. You didn't know. And based on what you didn't know, you decided he wasn't welcome. The silence in the room was the particular silence of a truth that has arrived and cannot be argued with. He's here, Frank said quietly. He came tonight. Keisha asked him to. He's in the parking lot. Gerald took off his reading glasses. He set them on the agenda. He sat in the silence for a long moment. Then he pushed his chair back from the table, stood up, walked out of the conference room, through the sanctuary, through the lobby, past the banner that said all are welcome, and out the front door into the cold November night. Arthur was sitting in a 10-year-old Toyota Corolla that belonged to Keisha's cousin, who had driven him over. Keisha was in the passenger seat. When the church door opened and Gerald stepped out into the cold, she got out of the car first. Pastor Cole, she said. Gerald looked at her. Then at the car. Then at the man who was getting out of the passenger side. Arthur stood in the parking lot in the same coat. Of course he did. He hadn't worn it as a costume. He wore it because it was the coat he had. Gerald walked toward him. He was not a man who had practice in this, in walking toward a moment that exposed him. He had spent 11 years building a posture of authority, of wisdom, of being the one who led others through their difficult moments. He had stood at bedsides and gravesides and hospital waiting rooms and said the right words. He knew how to be present in someone else's crisis. He did not know how to stand in the middle of his own. He stopped a few feet from Arthur. Arthur looked at him. I owe you an apology, Gerald said. His voice came out differently than his sermon voice. Smaller. More like the voice of a man and less like the voice of a position. Arthur waited. What I did last Tuesday, Gerald said, was wrong. I looked at you and I made a judgment. Not about your need. About your category. About whether you belonged in the room. He paused. And I enforced that judgment with language that sounded like policy. But it was a door. And the sign says no doors. Arthur was quiet for a moment. I know something about building things, he said at last. And one of the things I learned is that the hardest part is not building the wall. The hardest part is recognizing when you've built one where you didn't mean to. Gerald looked at him. I built a pantry, he said slowly, that I was proud of. And I was so proud of the idea of it that I stopped seeing what was actually happening inside it. That's how it goes, Arthur said. With most things. They stood in the cold together for a moment. The November air was sharp and clean. Inside the church, through the lit windows, you could see the warm rectangle of the conference room where the elders were sitting, waiting. I'd like to invite you inside, Gerald said. Not to the pantry. To the board meeting. I think there are things we need to hear, and I think you might be the right person to say them. Arthur looked at the church. At the lit windows. At the banner, just visible through the glass front door. All are welcome. All right, he said. He sat at the end of the conference table. He did not take off the coat. He looked at the faces around the table. 7 elders and deacons, Margaret and Frank among them. 2 younger faces he didn't know. 1 woman who reminded him, somehow, of his mother, and he spoke the way he had once spoken in boardrooms, quietly and without performance, the way a man speaks when what he has to say is simply true. He told them about the pantry, about why he had funded it, about what he had seen in his years of community development work, that resources directed at dignity produced different outcomes than resources directed at charity, and that the difference between those two things was almost entirely in how the door felt when you walked through it. He told them about what happened on Tuesday. Not to shame Gerald. Not to score a point. But because the room needed to hear it in his words, with his face attached to it, to understand what it felt like from the other side of the desk. He told them about what had happened to him over the last 3 years. He did not tell it for sympathy. He told it because it was the context, and without the context the lesson was incomplete. He had been a man with 800 employees and 4 companies, and he had stood in their lobby and been asked to prove his right to a box of canned goods. "I want to be clear," he said, when he was done. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel bad about what happened. Feeling bad is easy. What I'm asking you to think about is the invisible door. Every institution has one. The door the sign doesn't mention. The one you build out of comfort and assumption and the entirely human desire to sort people into categories you can manage." He looked at Gerald, directly, without cruelty. "The question is not whether you meant to build it. The question is what you do now that you know it's there." The room was quiet for a long time. Margaret Powell had her hand over her mouth. Frank Ellis was looking at the donation agreement with the eyes of a man reading something for the first time. Gerald Cole was looking at his hands. Keisha, sitting against the wall where she had not been invited to sit but had sat anyway, was watching Arthur with the expression of a woman watching something be built in real time and trying to memorize its architecture. It was Gerald who finally spoke. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that this is not me trying to recover my dignity. I don't think I've earned that back yet. But I want to ask," he paused. "Would you be willing to help us understand how to do this better? Not as an apology tour. As a design question. You built things for 30 years. You know what an open door looks like when it actually works. We clearly need to learn." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll think about it." It was not the dramatic yes the room might have hoped for. It was better. It was honest. The weeks that followed were quiet and complicated in the way that real change tends to be. Not cinematic, not accompanied by music, just slow and effortful and real. Gerald made a public statement to the congregation the following Sunday. He did not name Arthur. He had asked for Arthur's permission, and Arthur had declined to be named. He described what had happened in general terms, with enough specificity that anyone who needed to understand what he was confessing to could understand it. He stood in the pulpit in his good suit and spoke without notes, which he had never done before, and told his congregation that he had looked at a man through a lens he hadn't known he was wearing, and that the lens had been built from pride and assumption and a comfort with order that had curdled, without his noticing, into a comfort with exclusion. Some people in the pews were moved. Some were uncomfortable. 1 or 2 were defensive on his behalf in the way people sometimes are when the exposure of their leader feels like an exposure of themselves. Keisha sat in the 3rd row. She had come back, for this Sunday, for this, and watched Gerald stand in his own broken moment and do something she had not been certain he would be capable of. She felt something in herself settle. Not resolution. Exactly. Resolution was too clean a word. Something more like the feeling of a foundation being poured correctly after a wall had been torn down. Arthur came back to the lower hall the following Tuesday. Not for a food box. He came because he had said he'd think about it, and he had, and what he had thought was that the pantry had the bones of something good and what it needed was not a renovation but a reopening. A recommitment to its original purpose, with new eyes. He sat down with the volunteer coordinator and walked through the intake process from the beginning. He asked what assumptions were built into every step. Where did the process create friction for people who were already carrying the weight of needing to be there? Where did it signal, however subtly, that dignity was conditional on compliance? He was not doing it for Gerald. He was doing it because he believed, still, despite everything, that communities could be built around the dignity of the people inside them. He had believed it for 30 years and the last 3 had not taken it from him. only tested whether it would survive being tested. Walt, the older volunteer who had been moving boxes when Arthur first came in, approached him one afternoon at the end of the Tuesday session. "You're the man from before," Walt said. "The one Pastor Cole." "Yes," Arthur said. Walt nodded slowly. He was perhaps 70, with a weathered face and hands that showed decades of work. "I didn't say anything that day," he said. "When you walked out, I didn't say anything." "I know," Arthur said. "I should have," Walt said. "Yes," Arthur said. "But you're saying it now." Walt looked at him. "Is that enough?" Arthur thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved to be thought about. "It's a start," he said. Walt nodded. He reached out his hand. Arthur shook it. It was not a dramatic moment. Two older men in a church basement shaking hands over the quiet acknowledgement that something had been wrong and someone had noticed too late and was trying to notice better now. But it was real. And real things, Arthur had learned, were worth more than dramatic ones. Real things lasted. Gerald Cole did not have an easy winter. The exposure of a private failure carried in a very public confession does not resolve quickly, and he was not the kind of man who processed things quickly. He was the kind of man who had built his identity around certainty, and certainty, once cracked, requires a very specific kind of labor to rebuild, not restoration, because you cannot crack certainty, but something slower and more honest, the gradual construction of a different kind of groundedness. One that does not need to be certain. One that can stand in its own not knowing without reaching for the nearest wall. He began to visit Arthur. Not officially. Not as pastor and benefactor or any other arrangement of roles. He would find Arthur at the literacy program on Saturday mornings, where Arthur read with a 12-year-old boy named Marcus who had started the year 3 grades behind his reading level and was now, slowly, climbing. Gerald would sit at the table across the room and read with another student, and they would not talk much, and it was better that way, because what needed to happen between them was not primarily conversational. One Saturday in January, when the program had ended and the children had gone and the volunteers were cleaning up, Gerald said to Arthur, "Can I ask you something?" Arthur looked up from stacking chairs. "Why did you come back?" Gerald said, "After what I did. Why would you come back to help us?" Arthur set a chair down. He thought about it for a long time. Long enough that Gerald wondered if he would answer at all. "Because I know what it costs to give up on something you built," Arthur said at last. "And this pantry, this program, it's not just yours. It never was. It belongs to the people who walk through the door. And they don't have the luxury of being too proud to come back." He picked up another chair. "Besides," he said, almost quietly, almost to himself, "I needed something to do on Tuesday mornings." Gerald looked at him. Then something happened that had not happened to Gerald in a very long time in public. His eyes filled. He turned away, quickly, and made himself busy with a table. But Arthur had seen it. He had the grace not to mention it. Some things between people are completed in silence. Some forgiveness does not require the full ceremony of words. The following spring, the Grace Fellowship Food Pantry hung a new sign. It was not replacing the banner that said "All are welcome." No one turned away. That banner stayed. But beside it, on a smaller wooden plaque, the kind that weathers beautifully with time, were these words, chosen by a committee that included Margaret Powell, Frank Ellis, Keisha Watkins, and Arthur James Whitfield. "The test of our welcome is not who we invite. It is who we see when they arrive." Arthur stood in the lower hall on the morning the plaque went up. He wore a different coat. It was still not a new coat. He was not yet fully in the place where new coats were easy, but it fit him. It was clean. It had all its buttons. Keisha stood beside him. "How does it feel?" she asked. He looked at the plaque for a long moment. "Like something true," he said. And that, for now, was enough. There is a kind of pride that disguises itself so completely as principle that the person wearing it cannot tell the difference. It organizes itself into policies. It speaks in the language of stewardship and responsibility and order. It sincerely believes in the sign on the door. It just has not noticed, yet, the door it built inside the door. And there is a kind of grace that is more expensive than charity. Charity is a box of canned goods. Grace is what it costs to come back to the place that turned you away and say, the work here still matters, and so do the people it serves, and that is larger than what was done to me. Arthur Whitfield could have walked away. He could have walked away from that parking lot and from that church and from the particular cold sting of reading his own name on a donation agreement and understanding what it meant that the condition had not been kept. He had been through enough. No reasonable person would have blamed him for walking away. He didn't. Not because he was a saint. Because he understood, in a way that only certain kinds of loss can teach you, that the work of building things for other people is not sentimental. It is not a reward for the builder's good character. It is its own purpose, separate from whether the builder is thanked or credited or even treated well. The children at the literacy program needed someone to sit with them on Saturday mornings whether Arthur was having an easy year or a difficult one. The families who came to the pantry on Tuesdays needed their boxes whether Arthur felt the warmth of belonging there or the cold of a door. He stayed because the work needed doing. And because the most important test of character is not how you treat the people who see you clearly. It is how you treat the work when you are not seen at all. If this story moved something in you today, if it made you think about the invisible doors you might have built without meaning to, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. If this story moved something in you today, if it made you think about the invisible doors you might have built without meaning to, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. Stories that carry truth in them the way folktales always have, wrapped in human pain and human grace and the stubborn, enduring belief that people can do better when they understand what better looks like. Subscribe, and we'll see you next week.